This is Steve Orlins, President of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, and I'm thrilled today to be joined by Ryan Haas and Bruce Jones, who are the authors of a very recent Brookings paper called Rising to the Challenge: Navigating Competition, Avoiding Crisis, and Advancing U.S. Interests in Relations with China. I won't go over their bios to save time, but Bruce is director and a senior fellow in the Project on International Order and Strategy at Brookings, and Ryan is a senior fellow and the Michael H. Armacost Chair at Brookings, where he holds a joint appointment to the John L. Thornton China Center and the Center for East Asian Policy Studies. I should say, Ryan, that I just looked at your book program we did, and we have now 25,000 views of that interview. So I hope that this one even exceeds that. This is a must read. Those who have not read it and are tuning into this program, just go to brookings.org and download it. It is a very important piece of work put out by Brookings. My first question is the simple one. Why did you feel the need to put this out at this moment? And either of you can answer.
Maybe I'll start and Ryan should correct me. I think that'll be the normal course of the conversation. I'll say things and Ryan will point out where I'm wrong and get it right. But it really began, this whole project began with a series of conversations that we had with our Chinese counterparts at the Wuhan Internet Forum in 2017 and 2018. And at the time, I think our shared understanding was threefold: that there had been, for at that point approaching 40 years, a commonly understood framework for managing US-China relations, and that was running out of steam, that was no longer going to be adequate to managing the relationship in the new realities. Second, that the baseline of that new reality was strategic rivalry or strategic competition. Lots of people don't want to call it that for lots of political reasons, but at core, it is a rivalrous, competitive relationship. And third, that if that wasn't going to veer out into unwarranted conflict, that we needed a new framework for managing the relationship, one that could be understood on both sides and could be politically durable on both sides, that frankly acknowledged the realities of the relationship, but nonetheless strove to stop it from becoming conflictual. So that was the kind of generation of the project. It took some time to get from an initial idea to where we are now, but that's how it started.
Ryan?
Well, Steve, I would just add that I think it was important for us to put this piece out now to try to inject some positive thinking into the overall discourse in the U.S.-China relationship. This is a series of papers that were released in parallel. The Chinese counterparts released a paper in China. We released a paper in Washington, both ahead of our leaders level meeting earlier in this month. And it identified areas where there are overlap in our respective views and areas where there are differences. I think that both sides agree that it is preferable to avoid conflict if we can. Both sides believe that the United States and China should work to coexist with each other, and that there will be a dynamic interaction between each country to see if we were able to do so. These are important areas of alignment, but it also was important for us to identify where there were some areas of divergence. We felt that we could not subscribe to the view that our Chinese counterparts put forward, that the problems in the relationship were a result of America's anxiety over its decline, or that the United States-China relationship would get better if the United States just got out of China's business. We think that there are legitimate concerns that we have about China's conduct, both at home and abroad, and as well as its behavior towards many of our friends in Asia and around the world. So we wanted to try to put both the good and the bad out to try to provide as clear-eyed of a possible insight into the overall dynamics in the relationship as possible.
And Steve, if I could just add one further sentiment, which I'm sure we'll come back through, which is that we wanted to articulate a framework that could not only be sustainable in the United States, but that could sustain substantial engagement with our allies. Yeah. And that had been lost during the Trump years in important ways, but it also risked being lost with some of the kind of early statements out of this administration, or so some of the voices in Washington who wanted to go, in our sense, too far in what we called omnidirectional containment, which just wasn't going to get sustained buy-in from key allies that we think is necessary for an effective strategy over the long term.
Yeah, And when I remember I was with you in Wuzhen when we had these conversations, and we were on the canals in Wuzhen having those conversations. You know, the paper makes a lot of assumptions that I'd like to talk about. One, it says China is convinced the US is in decline. Do you think that is a uniform view in China? Do you think the leadership believes it, or it's a narrative put out by the Chinese media? And should that be the basis of the formulation of our policy?
Warren, why don't you start?
I think the basis of the formulation of our policy, Steve, is what maximizes our ability to influence how China pursues its interests, and what maximally allows us to protect and advance our own interests and values. The question that you're asking is secondary to that objective. And just as a matter of observation, I'm not aware of a lot of debate at senior levels of the Chinese leadership over whether or not the United States is in a form of decline. Now, we can quibble over whether it's relative or absolute decline, and we can also quibble over when that narrative emerged and how enduring it's been. I lived in Beijing in 2008. I remember hearing discussions along these lines then, and I haven't heard that discussion or debate mellow in the years since.
We should be clear that neither of us are operating under that assumption. You know, Ryan's book, as you know very well,
right?
Stronger, my previous book, Still Ours to Lead. They do not take as an assumption a narrative of American decline. But it's one thing to look at the underlying realities. It's another thing to look at the psychology of the other part of the relationship.
It seems to assume that China, because it's viewing US in decline, is making assumptions in their policies that they're going to surpass the United States, which I think, you know, I don't know who you're talking to, but that is not the conversations I'm having with the senior people in the Chinese government. In fact, they're quite careful not to say that. But it's, you know, I guess it's different folks. You say China's leaders have become more outspoken about the lessons that their governance model can offer others. Isn't that more about not interfering with their governance in China as opposed to governance in Africa, Latin America, Asia?
I think we've gone well past that point. I think there's a substantial amount of Chinese engagement on governance models in the places that you just mentioned, around technology, around development models, around health models, in the multilateral space. I think we've long since passed the point where China is not exporting any sense of its own arrangements. That's not to say that it's sort of rigidly doing that. It's not. But yeah, I think we're long past the point where it's merely worried about non-interference internally.
You agree with that, Ryan?
Yeah, I do. I don't subscribe to the view that we are in the midst of a universalistic ideological struggle with China, similar to the one that we had with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. But I think that both the United States and China believe that their governance models hold solutions to the problems that the 21st century presents. Both countries believe that their model is capable of addressing the problems of their citizens and offering solutions for people around the world. I think what we've watched is the Chinese become less about making their model has answers to other people's problems as well. It doesn't mean that they're trying to force it down anyone's throat, or for that matter, that their model is becoming any more attractive. It isn't. But there are aspects of their model, whether it's on suppression of dissent, controlling of discourse on the internet, that the Chinese are using and normalizing in ways that other autocrats or would-be autocrats are finding to be attractive.
Are the autocrats going to the Chinese to ask for that technology, or the Chinese forcing that upon these autocrats globally? Is it the Chinese government, or is it Chinese companies that are looking to make profits?
Not a huge daylight between those two things in this space, it seems to me, and the answer I think is much more the former than the latter. It's not, you know, I don't see the Chinese out there pushing these technologies down the throats of other countries, but we're certainly seeing an engagement from other authoritarian and autocratic governments looking to China to provide those technologies and support. We've seen quite a lot of that. I don't think that's central to our understanding of what's happening in the relationship, but it's certainly present.
What do you think? How do the kind of the assumptions that are made? How do you kind of think about China's financial opening to Western companies? How do you think about China's application to join the CPTPP? How do you think about China's application to join the Digital Economy Partnership? How do those fit into your view that China is simply becoming more statist?
It's interesting, you know, I'll have to be careful here because a lot of these conversations are Chatham House or otherwise off the record, but talking to senior people in the Chinese financial sector last time I was in Beijing, they make no secret of the fact that the financial opening has two purposes. It's about modernizing the Chinese financial system, and it's about minimizing Chinese exposure to American financial sanctions. Right? And those two things, I think, go hand in hand. The stronger that China is internally, the less they're dependent on American models, the less exposed they are to American pressure. That's obviously in their interests. It's perfectly rational for them to pursue both of those interests. So, second question, whether it's rational for the United States to facilitate those changes.
Opening up to financial services company that are American, European, Japanese, Korean does not make them less susceptible to US sanctions. It makes them more susceptible to US sanctions. To the extent that they become dependent upon that, it's the opposite.
Well, I don't agree with that, but more importantly, it was not their perception of it, right? So the line that they were arguing is that it made them less dependent. I mean, it seems to me that it does make them less vulnerable to it because, as in several other spaces we exist in, if we try to sort of torque that lever, we then impose quite a lot of costs on ourselves as well. I mean, it's sort of a very unusual relationship in right now where all the things that we could do to impose costs on China impose costs on us as well. And to a certain extent, vice versa. And the financial space is increasingly become one of those.
Opening their capital markets. I don't understand an argument that opening their capital markets makes them less susceptible to financial sanctions from the United States or any sanctions from the United States. That doing it, if sanctions occurred, then these companies would be required to pull trillions of dollars out of the Chinese markets, which would have an enormous effect. So I don't think
and enormous costs on us,
and greater costs on the Chinese. I think it's
Steve. Can I just make two observations? The first is I think I broadly agree with the point that you're making that that a lot of the discourse about China turning inward, closing off to the outside world is overblown. I think the examples that you cite provide ample evidence of the fact that they are continuing to open in certain areas. I think that they have their own reasons for wanting to do so, which is perfectly fine. I think they would like to increase the rest of the world's dependence upon them, broadly speaking, and reduce their dependence on others around the world. But just to take a half step back, Steve, I think that you're trying to turn this conversation into a bit of a caricature of a paper. Our paper is not about whether or not China is turning inwards or not. So we're happy to have this discussion if you'd like, but if there's anything about the paper you'd like to discuss, we'd certainly welcome a chance to.
I'm going down I get to the more positive points, but I was just dealing with some of that. I mean, I think it's a great paper, by the way. I think it has in it some terrific suggestions, which I think the Biden administration, in fact, the use of the term guardrails preceded then the Biden administration using the term guardrails. So obviously it's become a important kind of paper for the administration thinking about it, but I'm trying to start with some of the fundamental assumptions and then build to the recommendations. And I guess partly, there's a lot of talk about, what you call the widening consensus. And what worries me is, and again, maybe I'm characterizing it, but I don't see that consensus. I see a lot of dissent from that consensus. I not only see it in the think tank community, I see it in the political community. I see it in progressive Democrats. I see it in others who are worried, number one, about a self-fulfilling prophecy. Number two, about the times that the consensus in Washington have been fundamentally wrong and cost Americans dearly. Neither of you are old enough, but I lived through the consensus on the war in Vietnam, and I watched my classmates die as a result of a wrong consensus. You're both young enough to have experienced the consensus on WMD in Iraq. And I think this consensus on China, this demonization of China that requires that we go to accepting this strategic competition, has the risk of being a self-fulfilling prophecy. And what I worry about is the expenditures that are going to deprive our social programs, which Brookings talks so much, other parts of Brookings talk so much about, from funding. That this stuff, if we're going to have this strategic competition, you go back to the Eisenhower quote. You know, it's going to cost a lot for our social programs. So I worry a lot about that. What if the consensus is wrong?
So Steve, I think you'd have to work really hard to read this paper or read other of Ryan and my work and believe that this is around demonization of China. But it is fair to say, as I started with, that the starting point of this on both sides was a recognition that there is a central dynamic to the relationship that is competitive and even rivalrous. And if we don't acknowledge it, we risk it spinning out into outright conflict and enmity. So you can disagree with that premise, that's perfectly fair. But what this paper is about is, if you accept that there is a competitive dynamic to the relationship, how are we going to manage that competition in ways that don't spin it out into conflict, into enmity? Because it seems to me that you can have a perfectly reasonable set of diplomatic guardrails around a relationship that is competitive and rivalrous. But if it spins into enmity, if it spins into outright conflict, we're in a whole other world. And that's where this work is located, is trying to minimize the risks of that.
Yeah, I agree. And Steve, we've spoken enough to know that I share a lot of your skepticism about the idea of there being a hardened bipartisan consensus. I think that the consensus decomposes pretty quickly. The sooner you sort of go down level by level as to what it is we're trying to achieve and what cost we're willing to pay to do so. But look, this paper that we're here to discuss today is trying to navigate a path between omnidirectional containment on one hand and unidirectional softening on the other. We don't think that either of those poles are suitable as a basis for policy. And so we're trying to lay the groundwork to chart a middle course that we think can maximize our ability to advance our interests with China.
Yeah. Again, I always think of kind of the way Harry Harding framed it years ago, which is 3 levels of competition. You know, economic, we compete with everybody. We compete with Canada, we compete with the UK, it's fine, no problem. Diplomatic, you know, we compete with the French, we compete with others in terms of where we want to accomplish with our diplomacy. And strategic is a whole nother part. And when we compete strategically the way we did with the Soviet Union, it creates a diversion of funding that has such an impact, especially on poor people in the United States who need to benefit from those social programs. And I'm worried that we're allowing kind of that discussion to go unchallenged, that we're just going to say, okay, what is the kind of the framework you're putting in place mean for tariffs, for instance? Should we be reducing tariffs? Should we end tariffs? Or should we protect our industrial base through the use of tariffs?
I was never a fan of the tariffs of the Trump administration. They've never made any sense to me as a way of managing the relationship with China. They didn't work. But to your earlier point, I mean, I think it's simply not realistic to not think that we are now in a form of competition in the strategic space with the Chinese. We're making investments, they're making investments, we're in an arms race in the Western Pacific. Those are the realities. We can argue against them, we can do that, but our purpose here is not that. Our purpose here is to talk about how we put guardrails around it so that it doesn't spin into conflict and it doesn't spin into enmity, which is a very different thing than competition. One of the things that was challenging in the conversations with the Chinese around this is the different connotation of the word competition. To my mind, that's not a negative term. As you said, we compete with lots of people. This has a different character, and the use of the word strategic competition is designed to invoke that. They were much more uncomfortable with the word competition the longer we went in this conversation. But I think that there is a serious risk. I see the risk sort of inversely to you. Ryan may have a different point of view. It's that if we don't recognize the dynamic that we're in and invest adequately in the diplomacy to keep us safe within it, to create those guardrails, that it risks spinning out of control and escalating in dangerous ways. So personally, I was very happy to see, as you mentioned, I was very happy to see President Biden start to talk about guardrails, to ask Xi Jinping for a process to put some of those guardrails in place. Let's see how much comes out of that. I'm hopeful at least that they're well begun in it. The people inside the president's core team who are working this one, I think, recognize the risks in the relationship and recognize the need for that diplomacy, which is very different than where we were 3 years ago, let's say. But that to me is the real challenge, is investing in that diplomacy, investing in those guardrails to stop this relationship from going off the skids.
And you have this wonderful
Yeah,
section.
Steve,
Go ahead.
Steve, I was just going to add one thought, which is that I think our paper talks about focusing on what advances America's interest. To be specific about your question, tariffs demonstrably have not advanced America's interest. They have come at tremendous cost to our workers, to our companies, without providing offsetting benefits. So I just wanted to make sure that we close the loop on your question. And to Bruce's point, I think that the United States has put a lot of energy in the deterrence piece in recent months and years. Part of what our paper is trying to argue is that we need to balance that out with investment in the diplomatic efforts as well. Because when diplomacy and deterrence sort of operate side by side, they're self-reinforcing. When there's only one or the other, it's self-limiting.
Talk about I love this section. This was part of it I did love, which was the operationalizing persistent competition and calibrated cooperation. Talk about some of the things specifically that you suggest so people have a sense of it before they read the paper.
Ryan, why don't you kick off?
Well, part of what we're trying to argue is that competition and cooperation are going to coexist in this relationship. The competition will be persistent, but it need not inhibit areas where it serves our interest to cooperate with China. And the paper tries to provide a number of illustrative examples, such as on preparing for future pandemics, financial stability, dealing with nuclear nonproliferation, Iran, Afghanistan, and other issues, and suggests that there are ways that are better than others for fostering that type of collaboration. One of which is recognizing that neither side is going to be particularly enthusiastic about embracing an initiative that is viewed as coming from the other. And so to the extent that we're able to allow either middle powers or multilateral organizations to take the lead in having the United States and China moving in a common direction in support of that goal, it could unlock greater opportunity for cooperation.
Bruce?
Yeah, I just amplify that and the point we were talking about before, the guardrails, both on the track 1.5 level, in the direct bilateral level, in relationship between policymakers. That's been lagging over the last several years. We used to spend a lot more time doing that than we do now. We'd like to see a reversal of that process. As Ryan mentioned, and this is, it's not a normal thing in Washington to talk about multilateralism, but we do think that actually it's going to matter to managing the relationship to not always have everything fall into the bilateral space, where distrust and lack of relationships can really impede collaboration, but to allow some third parties to craft the space that we can work in. That's not going to be comfortable for either Washington or Beijing, but if you just look at the way both of us mishandled COVID, if you look at the climate discussion, it seems to me that there's ample space for third parties to help carve out policy initiatives and frameworks for moving forward. And the United States is going to have to get a lot more comfortable with exploring those kinds of diplomatic spaces than we often have been.
Yeah. Now the paper is now it came out 4 weeks ago now, 5 weeks ago. And it talks about a prevailing pessimism. I actually think that we hit rock bottom. And the release of Meng Wanzhou, the release of the Canadian Michaels, the release of the Liu children, the Sullivan Yang Jiechi meeting, the Xi Biden meeting, the establishment of an agreement to readmit U.S. journalists back, some cooperation on releasing reserves from our strategic petroleum reserves, and that actually we're beginning to, that pessimism is actually beginning to fade away. And there's a realization, which is what makes the paper so important, because it can kind of put in place structures that can maintain the positive points while dealing with the continuing competition. But do you still have, I mean, Ryan, are you still as pessimistic as you were 8 weeks ago before the Meng Wanzhou release?
No, I'm not as pessimistic as I was then, but I'm also not, brimming with optimism either. I think that the relationship is settling into an equilibrium that will probably last for the next year. My sense is that there's a pretty firm floor under the relationship, with both leaders committing to remain personally engaged in it. But there's also a pretty firm ceiling on the relationship as well, given that domestic drivers in both countries are going to have an outsized effect on the conduct of the relationship over the next year. But what I think has been a positive development over the past 8 weeks, just stepping back from the list that you provided, Steve, which was very good, was that there seems to be a mutual awareness that the relationship benefits by having a little bit more Zurich and a little bit less Anchorage, in the sense of quiet, professional, serious meetings rather than sort of loud, accusatory exchanges. And it speaks to, I think, a view that what needs to have been said has been said, and now it's time to start doing what needs to be done, which I warmly welcome.
And we start the section that you did like, the operationalizing persistent competition, with the notion that we need to avoid excess expectations, for good or bad. Right? If we get too optimistic about where things are, we're going to be sorely disappointed. If we're too pessimistic, we're going to miss opportunities. Trying to establish some sort of sense of that's why the word persistent. There is a kind of dynamic here that it's going to be at play for some time. It can be managed. It doesn't have to spin out of control. We don't accept the kind of fatalistic sense that we're automatically heading towards conflict. We reject that. But it does require that investment in diplomacy, that investment in leader-to-leader relationships, that investment in multilateral mechanisms, a range of tools to manage the relationship under the new realities that we find ourselves in.
Yeah, I think it's great, and again, I have focused on some of my disagreements with the paper, but I think by and large, I think it's an extremely worthwhile contribution. And what I've done is I've just whetted the appetite of everybody who's going to watch this to make sure they download the paper to read the positive parts. But it's really an extremely valuable contribution. And last question, I guess, is you had the president of Brookings sign this, which is that's putting a lot of weight. Is that ordinary at Brookings?
Well, he was part of the dialogue that we had. He came to several of the sessions. He made contributions along the way. So, this is not, me and Ryan write it and he added his name. We tend not to do that at Brookings. He was a partner in this process. Ryan may have done more of the wordsmithing than me and John, but in truth, we were along for the ride the whole way. So he's not, he's just not an add-on, and he doesn't sign his name to things that other people have done. He was a partner in this process. I think that mattered. He's a serious guy. He's got a lot of experience in managing different parts of the security agenda around China's borders. He's been in the sort of upper reaches of American defense policy for many years. So he has a kind of sobriety on this issue that is helpful. He brought a lot of insight to the process and a lot of realism. So there was a huge contribution. This is why his name is on it.
I want to thank you guys for giving so generously of your time. The paper is Rising to the Challenge, Navigating Competition, Avoiding Crisis, and Advancing U.S. Interests in Relations with China. It is available on the Brookings website, brookings.org. You can download it. I did, and as you can see, went over it pretty carefully. But Bruce, Ryan, thank you so much.
Thanks for having us on.
Thank you, Steve.